In a video I did just prior to this one, I talked about a label that has been placed on black people, whether they're in the Caribbean, the United States, maybe even in Africa. A label that has said that black people are lazy and don't want to do the work. Now, obviously, there are lazy people amongst black people, just like amongst other people. But that label seems to get tossed around when it comes to black people. And I'm going to give you an example of where was rather dangerous. It just led to just years of unnecessary strife and tension. Just stay tuned and I'll tell you all about the story. As you've probably heard me say many times, or point out many times, that the British ended slavery in their empire. I'm not talking about other empires, mind you, but they ended slavery in their empire in 1834, with full emancipation taking place in 1838. Now, they had ended the slave trade itself in their empire earlier that same century, I think in the early 1800s, 1803 or 1805. Well, of course, back in those days, an area known as British Guyana, which we call Guyana today, was a part of that British Empire down in the Caribbean region. So when they ended slavery, you have to understand a lot of rich white planters had made a massive fortune off of the backs of enslaved Africans. One guy was this guy right here. He didn't live in British Guyana. He actually lived back in England. He would be considered what you call an absentee planter. Well, this guy right here, his name was William Gladstone. And he made a pretty penny. But because these guys were influential because of all their money, when it came to politics, so think about what's going on today, right here in the United States. He decided to lead a group of planters who were very upset that the British government ended slavery. So with their influence, their power, and their money, they went to the British government and they basically said, listen, you ended slavery. You ended slavery. And by ending slavery, you've pretty much effectively gotten rid of our workforce. All those enslaved Africans down there in our colonies, you've given them the permission to basically walk off the plantation. We want compensation for that. You've got to give us some money. You've got to compensate us for losing our workforce. You know, what's up with you? The British government, realizing that these guys had a lot of power and a lot of influence, capitulated and basically said, all right, you know what? We're going to try to work out something here. So what they did, they gave this guy and a bunch of other planters on different islands in different places, gave them buttloads of money. As a matter of fact, this guy, for compensation, I think walked away with the equivalent of $69 million in today's money, or $690 million, somewhere around there. It may have even been in the billions. Or I think it may have been billions of dollars that was split up amongst all these rich planters that lost their labor force due to the ending of slavery. So this guy was one of them. What he did with his money was he decided he's going to take that money and he is going to invest in this thing called, he's going to get himself some indentured servants. At the time, England had taken over, some years earlier, had taken over the Indian subcontinent. And now India, of course, had a lot of people, and a lot of people were poor and impoverished after, of course, England, impoverished that once proud nation. So in doing so, people came to him and said, hey, listen, man, there's a lot of people over there in India. They're poor, they're destitute, they're desperate. We can probably get them to come over here and work in these plantations we had down there, because these African people have walked off the plantations and they don't want to work. Now, here is what was going on. The enslaved Africans had a certain amount of leverage at that time. And the leverage they had was basically, hey, listen, we're not going to come back to your plantations. You've got to compensate us. We heard you compensated these guys. What about us? we're not coming back and working on anybody's plantation until we get paid. So the British government initially, they were listening to their cries. But then when this guy, Gladstone, decided, you know what? I am going to go ahead and get a lot of people from the Indian subcontinent. I'm going to bring them over to these colonies and I'm going to put them to work. So the difference with them is that they're supposed to be paid. They're indentured servants. They're not enslaved people, but we'll bring them over. So needless to say, on May 5th, if I'm not mistaken, I forgot what year it was. I think it was 1835, if I'm not mistaken. You had ships coming the first ship came from India, bringing over these people from the Indian subcontinent. They were known as the Gladstone Coolies. That's Kuli. Now, I know that word may be derogatory to some people who are listening to me right now. If you're of Indian descent and you're from Guyana or Trinidad, I'm not intending to offend anyone. But that was the name that they call them, Gladstone Coolies, because in India, the people that did menial jobs, did the dirty work and everything, they were called coolies, Kulis. Of course, over here, people spell it different. But he brought them over, they came over, and of course, the British, who were masters of manipulating and dividing and conquering, brought them over and basically started to put in their minds, hey, look at them Africans over there. See, they don't want to work. We had to bring you guys in to work because they don't want to work. They're being lazy. Not realizing that the Africans were sitting on the sideline because they had a certain amount of leverage. This does not mean that none of them went back to work and any of the plantations, but they were using holding out as leverage to get compensation for the 200 and something years that they were enslaved. Well, under the British flag, it would have been only a few decades, but they were going and using that leverage to go to the bargaining table, to bring the British to the bargaining table, that if you want us to continue working on these plantations now that we're free, you're going to have to pay us. And not only pay us, you're going to have to compensate us for all these years of misery that we had to go through, breaking our backs to make you the empire that you are. Now, these people coming from India don't really know all about this. They know that the British are over there too, but they're coming over and probably not fully aware of the history that was going on. But the British goes over to them and it's like, hey, look at them. They're lazy. They don't want to work. They don't want to do nothing. That's why you guys are here. And another big difference is that when the Indian people came over, the people from India came over, they were able to come over and hold on to their religion. They were able to come over with their families. They were able to hold on to their names. The difference was with the Africans, when they came over in chains. Their religion was taken away from them. They were given different names. So we had two entirely different dynamics here. Needless to say, the British then goes to the Africans or the formerly enslaved Africans and say, hey, look at them people. They're coming over and taking your jobs. Coming and taking over your jobs. Keep an eye on them, Watch out for them. Meanwhile, they're on the other side telling the people from India, hey, look at them Africans. Watch out for them, You keep an eye on them. Just keep an eye on them, Whatever. Divide and conquer. So these two groups are looking at one another, side-eyeing one another. Meanwhile, these guys up here are staying on the top, just chilling, because they have these people down here fighting. They have these people down here looking at one another. So when it comes to this, I know it's much more complex than this, and I got to kind of close it out because of the video. My wife, who's from Guyana, when I speak to her, I said, hey, is this stuff taught in school? Because, when you go to a place like Guyana, there's still a lot of racial tension, especially when it bubbles up during election time. And I don't know if I've ever gotten a straight answer, but this is the basis for a lot of the stuff that goes on right now in terms of racial dealings with different groups there in Guyana. But this guy here, William Gladstone, walked off with billions, basically, or millions, hundreds of millions. His son went on to become Prime Minister of England, if I'm not mistaken, twice or three times, right? So you see how they benefited? Look at where black folks are. Look at where the Indian folks are. At each other's throats still, up to a certain extent.